Some people drown long before the river takes them. Elias Crow understood that the moment he saw the woman floating beneath the storm water. The Red Hollow River had turned black under the midnight rain, swollen nearly 20 feet wider than usual, roaring through the canyon like something alive and angry. Most men in the territory knew better than to ride near it after dark. Elias should have known better too. But loneliness makes a man careless with danger. His horse stopped first. Old Boone planted his hooves into the mud and refused another step. That was when Elias heard it. Not screaming, not splashing, just the faint sound of coughing somewhere below the riverbank. Human, weak, fading. Elias slid from the saddle and moved through the rain with one hand on the lantern hanging at his side. The wind shoved cold water against his coat hard enough to sting his skin. Down near the flooded rocks, something pale drifted against the current. At first he thought it was cloth tangled in branches. Then the lightning cracked across the canyon sky, and he saw a hand. He reached the river just as the current tried to pull her under again. The woman's dark hair spread across the water like ink. Her fingers clawed weakly against the rocks before slipping free. Elias didn't think. Men who live alone too long stop thinking during moments like that. They just move. The river slammed into him waist deep, cold enough to steal breath from his lungs. He caught her by the arm inches before the current dragged her downstream toward the canyon drop nearly half a mile away. She was lighter than he expected. Not fragile, just exhausted. The kind of exhausted that settled into a person long before their body finally gave up. By the time he carried her inside the cabin, both of them were shaking from the cold. Rain hammered the roof overhead, while water dripped from his hat onto the wooden floorboards. Elias kicked the door shut behind him and laid the woman carefully beside the fire pit. She wore a patchy clothing beneath a soaked brown shawl, though much of it had been torn by river rocks and branches. Her breathing came shallow and uneven. For a long moment, Elias simply stood there staring into the firelight, unsure what to do next. It had been 6 years since another person crossed the doorway of that cabin. 6 years since his wife died, coughing blood into his hands during the winter fever. Since then, silence had become easier than people. The woman stirred suddenly. Her eyes opened fast, dark and sharp despite the exhaustion inside them. Fear flashed across her face the second she saw him. Not panic, not confusion, recognition, the kind born from hard experience. Elias stepped back immediately and raised both hands slightly. "Easy," he said quietly. "You're safe here." The woman tried to sit upright too quickly and winced as pain caught somewhere in her ribs. Her gaze darted toward the door first, then the windows, then finally toward the leather satchel clutched tightly against her chest. Elias noticed she still hadn't let go of it. Not even in the river. Outside, thunder rolled across the canyon. Somewhere far off, horses whinnied through the storm. The woman's breathing grew uneven again. "They followed me," she whispered. Her voice sounded rough from river water and cold air. Elias frowned. "Who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stared at the fire for several seconds before speaking again, softer this time. "Don't leave," she said. Elias froze near the table. The woman's trembling fingers moved slowly toward the buttons of her soaked shawl. Her eyes never lifted to meet his. "Will you stay?" she whispered carefully. "If I undress." The cabin fell silent except for the sound of rain striking the roof. Elias felt something cold move through his chest then. Not desire, not temptation, something heavier. Because no woman asked a question like that unless life had already taught her to fear the answer. Elias turned away first. That surprised her more than the fire, more than the dry blanket he placed beside her without a word, more than the fact that a white rancher had dragged her out of the Red Hollow River instead of leaving her to disappear beneath it. Most men stared. Some pretended not to. But eventually, they all looked the same way. Elias Crow kept his eyes on the iron kettle hanging over the fire while steam slowly rose. Into the dim cabin light. "There is coffee in the tin by the shelf," he said quietly. "If your hand stops shaking enough to pour it." The woman studied him in silence. Rainwater still dripped from strands of dark hair resting against her shoulders. She loosened the soaked shawl carefully, inch by inch, as though even fabric carried memory. Elias heard the wet cloth slide onto the floorboards behind him. He did not turn around. Outside, thunder rolled low across the canyon. The old cabin creaked beneath the wind the way tired bones creak before winter. You always rescue strangers from rivers? She asked after a long while. Elias shrugged once. First one so far. A faint sound escaped her then. Not laughter exactly. Just surprise softening into something smaller. He poured coffee into 2 worn tin cups and slid one toward the edge of the table nearest her without stepping closer. The woman wrapped both hands around the cup immediately, letting the heat settle into her fingers. For several seconds neither spoke. The fire cracked softly between them. Somewhere outside, Boone shifted in the stable, restless from the storm. Elias finally glanced toward her only long enough to notice fresh bruising near her wrist and a thin line of blood running beneath her sleeve where the river rocks must have caught her. Then he looked away again. The woman noticed that too. You are careful, she said quietly. Most men are not. Elias sat slowly in the chair beside the window. Most men do not spend 6 years talking only to horses. The corner of her mouth moved slightly at that. It vanished almost immediately. She reached instinctively toward the leather satchel resting beside her boots. Even now she kept one hand touching it, like a mother checking the breathing of a sick child in the dark. Elias noticed how worn the leather looked. Expensive once. Important still. You nearly drowned carrying that thing, he said. Must be worth more than gold. Her eyes lifted sharply to his face then. Guarded. Measuring. Gold destroys everything it touches out here, she answered softly. This is worth more than that. Another silence settled over the cabin, heavier this time. Elias leaned back slightly as the firelight flickered across the wooden walls. He could smell river mud drying on his boots, smoke clinging to old pine beams, coffee turning bitter in the kettle. Familiar smells. Safe smells. But the woman sitting near his fire felt like trouble carried in by the storm itself. Not because she frightened him, because she reminded him how long it had been since another living soul sat inside that cabin. What is your name? He asked finally. The woman hesitated before answering. Nayeli. The name settled into the room quietly. Apache. Soft around the edges, but carrying strength underneath. Elias nodded once. Elias Crow. She looked toward the empty side of the cabin then, toward the second chair near the cold corner table. Dust rested thick across it except for one folded gray blanket lying untouched over the backrest. Your wife? She asked carefully. Elias stared into the fire for several seconds too long. Gone, he answered. Nayeli lowered her eyes after that. Some wounds recognized each other without explanation. The storm outside began easing at last, rain softening against the roof. But then Boone whinnied sharply from the stable. Elias straightened immediately. Nayeli's fingers tightened around the satchel so fast the leather creaked. Both of them heard it a second later. Hoofbeats. Distant. More than one horse moving through the mud toward the cabin. The hoofbeats stopped somewhere beyond the cottonwood trees east of the cabin. Not close enough to see faces. Close enough to make Boone nervous again. Elias rose slowly from the chair beside the window and reached for the rifle mounted above the fireplace. The movement alone changed the air inside the cabin. Nayeli set the coffee cup down without a sound. Her fingers moved toward the satchel immediately. Elias noticed the fear in her eyes now looked different than before. Not panic. Recognition. Like she already knew exactly who rode through the storm searching for her. The lantern flame flickered hard as another gust of wind pressed against the cabin walls. Elias stepped carefully toward the front window and lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to see outside. Rain still drifted across the valley in thin silver sheets beneath the moonlight. 3 riders stood near the tree line about 70 yards away, watching. None of them moved toward the cabin. Somehow that felt worse. Friends of yours? Elias asked quietly. Nayeli did not answer right away. Her gaze remained fixed on the fire. Men like that do not have friends, she said finally. Elias kept watching the riders. One sat tall in the saddle wearing a long dark coat despite the rain. Another carried a lantern low near his leg. The third rider never stopped scanning the cabin windows. Patient men. Men used to hunting. Elias let the curtain fall back into place. You want to tell me why 3 strangers are riding through canyon floodwater for one woman? Nayeli lowered her eyes. For several seconds, only the crackling fire spoke between them. Then she reached down slowly and placed the leather satchel onto the table. The worn straps looked nearly torn through from hard travel. Water still dripped from the corners onto the wood floor beneath it. Elias noticed her hands trembling slightly now. Not from cold anymore. My husband carried this before he died, she said softly. He told me if anything happened to him, I was never to let it fall into another man's hands. Elias looked at the satchel but did not touch it. What is inside? Naeli hesitated again. Truth. The answer settled heavy inside the little cabin. Outside, thunder rolled farther away now, fading toward the mountains. One of the horses near the tree line snorted sharply. Still waiting. Elias pulled out the chair across from her and sat carefully. Truth usually does not bring riders in the middle of the night. Naeli nodded once. No, but land does. Money does. Fear does. Her fingers slowly loosened the satchel straps. Elias expected gold. Maps maybe. Instead, she pulled out a stack of folded papers wrapped carefully in oilcloth to keep them dry. Official papers. Some carried faded government seals. Others looked handwritten and old. One page slipped sideways beneath the lantern light, and Elias caught a glimpse of signatures at the bottom. His stomach tightened immediately. He recognized one of the names. Walter. Crow. His father. Naeli saw the change in his face. You know that name, she said quietly. Elias stared at the paper another second before answering. He was my father. Neither moved after that. The fire cracked softly behind them while the wind moaned through gaps in the cabin walls. Naeli looked almost disappointed somehow. Not angry, just tired. Then maybe the river should have taken me after all, she whispered. Elias frowned sharply. What does that mean? Naeli swallowed once before speaking again. Your father signed the transfer papers that forced Apache families off Blackstone Valley 15 years ago. My husband found proof the land was stolen through false agreements. Those men outside. She glanced toward the dark windows. They work for the people who do not want those papers reaching a courtroom. Elias leaned back slowly in the chair. The room suddenly felt smaller than before. Hotter too. He remembered his father sitting silent at supper tables for years after leaving government work. Remembered the whiskey, the guilt, the long nights staring at nothing. But Elias never asked questions back then. Sons rarely did. Outside, one of the riders finally started moving toward the cabin through the mud. The knock came slow and heavy against the cabin door. Not the nervous knock of a traveler asking shelter from the rain. This sounded patient. Certain. The kind of knock that already believed it owned whatever waited on the other side. Elias remained seated for half a second longer, staring at the papers spread across the table beneath the lantern light. His father's signature still sat there like a ghost dragged out of the dirt after 15 years. Walter Crow. The same careful handwriting Elias remembered from old Bible pages and unpaid ranch ledgers. Only now those letters carried something darker. Naeli quickly wrapped the papers back inside the oilcloth and pushed them into the satchel again. Her movements stayed calm, but Elias noticed her breathing had become shallow. She was preparing herself for disappointment. He understood that look. People carried it when life taught them help always came with conditions. Another knock echoed through the cabin. Boone whinnied sharply outside. Elias finally stood and grabbed the rifle from beside the fireplace. He did not point it toward the door. He simply held it low at his side while stepping onto the porch. Cold rain drifted sideways beneath the roof overhang. The rider waiting outside sat tall on a dark horse, water dripping from the brim of his hat. He looked older than Elias expected. Late 50s maybe. Thin face. Silver beard trimmed neat. Expensive gloves despite the mud. The man smiled slightly when he saw Elias. Evening, he said smoothly. Bad weather for visitors. Elias did not return the smile. Then you should not be visiting. The stranger glanced toward the cabin windows. We are looking for a woman. Elias leaned one shoulder against the porch beam. A lot of women in the territory. Apache widow. Mid-20s. Dark hair. Carries a leather satchel. The rain tapped softly against the porch roof between them. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled over the hills again. Elias studied the rider carefully. Men who hunted cattle rustlers usually carried anger. Men chasing thieves carried excitement. This man carried neither. Only calculation. You law? Elias asked. Business, the rider answered. Name is Victor Lang. Elias had heard it before. Most ranchers in Blackstone territory had. Lang owned rail contracts, cattle routes, and enough judges to make honest men nervous. Rumors followed him like dust storms. Land deals. Missing witnesses. Families pushed off property overnight. None of it ever reached courtrooms. That woman stole documents belonging to my associates, Lang continued calmly. Dangerous documents in the wrong hands. Elias glanced back once toward the cabin door behind him. And if I said nobody came through here tonight? Lang smiled again, though this time it looked tired. Then I would say you are either lying, or you have not looked closely enough at the woman you rescued. Elias felt those words settle deeper than they should have, because part of him already wondered the same thing. Nayeli had secrets stitched into every silence she carried. Still, something about Lang's voice bothered him more than the storm. He sounded less interested in recovering papers than burying them forever. You should leave, Elias said quietly. River crossing east of here will flood by morning. Lang studied him for several seconds. Rainwater rolled slowly down the side of his face beneath the hat brim. Your father was a respected man once, he said suddenly. Elias stiffened slightly. You knew Walter Crowe? Everyone in Blackstone knew him. Lang adjusted the reins loosely in one gloved hand. Especially after the Valley transfers. Shame how guilt ruined him toward the end. Elias said nothing. Lang nodded once toward the cabin. The woman inside believes those papers can change history. They cannot. They can only get people buried beside it. Then his eyes hardened slightly for the first time. If she remains here by sunrise, Mr. Crowe, men less patient than me will arrive. Lang turned his horse slowly after that. The other two riders emerged from the darkness near the trees and followed him through the rain without another word. Elias stood motionless on the porch long after they disappeared into the canyon mist. When he finally stepped back inside the cabin, Nayeli was no longer sitting near the fire. She stood beside the back door with the satchel over her shoulder and tears shining silently in her eyes. I should go, she whispered. Elias closed the cabin door behind him slowly while rainwater dripped from the brim of his hat onto the floorboards. Nayeli remained beside the back entrance with the satchel hanging from one shoulder, her hand gripping the leather strap tightly enough to whiten her knuckles. The firelight flickered across her face, catching the exhaustion beneath her calm expression now that the fear had nowhere left to hide. If I stay here, she said softly, those men will come back with more. Elias removed his gloves one finger at a time and set the rifle beside the table. Probably. Nayeli looked at him carefully, almost confused by the answer. Most men would have argued. Promised safety they could not guarantee. Elias Crowe had lived too long with silence to waste words pretending storms were sunshine. She swallowed once and shifted the satchel higher against her shoulder. Then why did you tell them to leave? Elias walked toward the stove and poured the last of the coffee into his cup before answering. Because it is my cabin. The simple answer settled over the room heavier than shouting ever could. Nayeli stared at him for several seconds after that. Somewhere outside, water dripped steadily from the roof into the muddy yard below. The storm had begun moving east toward the mountains, leaving behind the cold smell of wet earth and pine sap. Elias leaned one shoulder against the counter and studied the woman standing near his back door. She looked ready to run even now, like a deer that had survived too many winters by never standing still long enough to trust shelter. You should not involve yourself in this, she whispered. You do not even know me. Elias took a slow drink from the tin cup. Bitter, burned from sitting too long over the fire. I know enough. Nayeli lowered her eyes briefly. No, she said quietly. You know what people like Victor Lang allow men like you to know. Elias frowned slightly at that. The words carried no accusation, only weariness. The kind carved slowly into someone after years of watching truth disappear beneath money and fear. Nayeli carefully removed the satchel from her shoulder and placed it back onto the table. My husband believed paper could stop men like Lang, she said softly. He thought if the courts saw the signatures, saw the false boundaries, saw the payments hidden from the Apache families, then justice would matter. Her fingers rested gently against the worn leather. He died still believing that. Elias watched the fire for a long moment before speaking. And you? Nayeli looked toward the dark window beside the fireplace. Beyond the glass, the river still roared through the canyon unseen. I think men protect whatever keeps them comfortable, she answered quietly. Truth usually makes people uncomfortable. Elias could not argue with that. He remembered his father during those last years after leaving Blackstone Valley. Walter Crowe stopped attending church, stopped laughing, stopped sleeping much too. Sometimes Elias would wake before dawn and find him sitting outside alone, staring toward the hills where Apache families once lived before government wagons pushed them west. Back then, Elias thought old age hollowed men out. Now he wondered if guilt did it first. Nayeli slowly reached toward the fire, warming her hands carefully above the flames. Her wet hair had begun drying in soft, dark waves around her shoulders. The bruises near her wrist looked darker now beneath the lantern glow. Elias noticed she still flinched slightly any time the cabin would creak too loudly. "You can sleep here tonight," he said finally. "No one crosses Red Hollow after midnight unless they have a death wish." Nayeli almost smiled at that. "Almost. You say that like death waits in the river." Elias stared into the fire another second before answering. "Out here, it usually waits inside people first." Silence followed. Not awkward silence. Heavy silence. Honest silence. Then Nayeli reached carefully beneath the collar of her borrowed blanket and pulled out something hanging around her neck on a thin leather cord. A silver wedding band. Simple. Worn smooth with years. She stared at it quietly before speaking again. "My husband trusted a man named Walter Crow once," she whispered. Elias felt the room grow colder immediately. Nayeli finally lifted her eyes toward him. "Before your father signed those papers, he promised my husband he would help us." Elias did not answer right away. The fire snapped softly between them while wind pushed rainwater against the cabin windows in slow, uneven streaks. Nayeli lowered the silver ring back beneath the blanket around her shoulders and stared into the flames as though she regretted speaking his father's name aloud. Most people in Blackstone territory spoke about Walter Crow carefully these days. Quietly, like mentioning a dead man's mistakes might wake them again. Elias sat down near the table and rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. He suddenly looked older than before. Not in years. In memory. "My father never talked about Blackstone Valley," he said finally. "Not after he came home from government work." Nayeli nodded faintly. "Because silence is easier than shame." Elias glanced toward her sharply at that, but there was no anger in her face. Only exhaustion layered over old disappointment. She rose carefully from the chair beside the fire and crossed the cabin slowly, her bare feet silent against the wooden floorboards. The bruising near her wrist had darkened into deep blue beneath the lantern light. Elias noticed she kept one hand pressed lightly against her ribs each time she moved. River injuries. Or older ones. Hard to tell anymore. Nayeli stopped beside the small shelf near the kitchen basin where an old framed photograph rested beneath a thin layer of dust. A woman stood beside Elias in the picture, blonde hair pinned back neatly, one hand resting on his arm, smiling at something beyond the camera frame. "Your wife had kind eyes," Nayeli said quietly. Elias stared toward the photograph for a long moment before speaking. Claire smiled at everybody. His voice softened slightly around the name. "Drove me crazy sometimes." Nayeli looked back toward him. "What happened to her?" Elias leaned back in the chair slowly, the wood creaking beneath his weight. "Winter fever. 6 winters ago." He paused once. "Doctor could not make it through the mountains in time." The room fell quiet again after that. Not empty quiet. Shared quiet. The kind two wounded people understand without trying to fix. Nayeli traced one finger gently along the dusty edge of the photograph frame. "My husband used to smile at strangers too," she whispered. "He believed people became better when someone trusted them first." Elias gave a faint dry laugh beneath his breath. That philosophy did not survive Blackstone territory very well. For the first time all night, Nayeli's expression softened into something close to warmth. Small. Fragile. Gone almost immediately. She returned slowly toward the fire and lowered herself onto the blanket near the hearth again. Outside, the storm had weakened into a cold, steady drizzle. Water dripped from the roof in slow, rhythmic taps against the mud below. Elias poured fresh water into the kettle and hung it over the fire without speaking. His movements carried the quiet habits of a man who had lived alone too long. Efficient. Careful. Lonely. "Why did your father promise to help us?" Nayeli asked suddenly. Elias looked over his shoulder. "You said he knew your husband." Thomas rode with the survey teams translating Apache boundaries during the valley negotiations, she explained softly. "He believed the government wanted peace. Your father told him the agreements would protect both sides." Her eyes lowered toward the flames. Then the papers changed. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. He remembered one night, nearly 15 years earlier, when his father came home drunk enough to barely stand. Walter Crow had sat at the kitchen table until sunrise staring at his own hands. Elias asked what happened. His father only answered once. Sometimes men sign things they can never wash off. Back then Elias thought he meant whiskey debts. Now he understood differently. Nayeli slowly untied the leather satchel once more and removed a folded yellow paper from inside. Unlike the others, this one looked older. Personal. She held it carefully between both hands before offering it across the table toward Elias. "Your father wrote this 3 months before he died," she said quietly. Elias hesitated before taking the paper. The handwriting hit him immediately. Walter Crowe. Shaking now. Uneven, but unmistakable. Elias unfolded the letter slowly while firelight trembled across the faded ink. The first sentence alone drained the color from his face. "If this letter reaches you, then I finally found the courage to tell the truth about Blackstone Valley." Elias read the first line 3 times before his hands finally stopped shaking enough to continue. The firelight moved across the page while the old paper crackled softly between his fingers. Walter Crowe's handwriting looked weaker than Elias remembered, but the gilt inside the words felt sharp as broken glass. "I signed the Valley papers knowing they were altered after the Apache leaders agreed to the original terms." Elias swallowed hard. Across the room, Nayeli sat silently beside the fire with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching him carefully without interrupting. Outside, dawn still hid beyond the mountains. The cabin remained trapped in that strange hour between night and morning when every sound feels louder than it should. Elias continued reading. "Victor Lang and the others threatened to destroy families if I refused. They said peace required sacrifice. They lied." The paper trembled slightly in Elias's hand now. He remembered his father during those final years more clearly than ever before. The whiskey bottles hidden beneath the barn floor. The sleepless pacing. The way Walter Crowe avoided mirrors near the end of his life. Elias once thought grief hollowed men slowly. Now he understood shame could do the same thing. He knew. Elias whispered finally. Nayeli lowered her eyes toward the fire. "Yes." Elias looked up sharply. "Then why keep this hidden all these years?" Her expression tightened with old pain. "Because men like Lang own sheriffs. Judges too." She paused briefly. "My husband believed timing mattered. He spent years gathering proof before he trusted anyone enough to reveal it." Elias stared back down at the letter. Another line near the bottom caught his attention immediately. "If my son ever reads this, tell him I tried to stop them before the end." Elias felt the breath leave his chest slowly after that. Not because the words forgave anything. They did not. But for the first time in years, he understood why his father died looking like a man drowning on dry land. Nayeli rose quietly from beside the fire and crossed toward the window. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. A pale gray dawn spread slowly over the canyon, turning the river into moving silver beneath the early light. "Thomas trusted your father until the very end," she said softly without turning around. Even after the papers changed, Elias folded the letter carefully and placed it back onto the table. "Your husband sounds like a better man than most." Nayeli rested one hand lightly against the window frame. "He believed people could choose honesty even after making terrible mistakes." A faint bitter smile touched her face. "I told him that belief would get him hurt someday." Elias noticed she said hurt instead of killed. Like even now she refused to give cruel men ownership over the memory of her husband. The cabin remained quiet for several seconds. Then Boone whinnied loudly outside again. Different this time. Not nervous. Warning. Elias moved toward the front window immediately. 3 riders had returned to the tree line. More horses stood behind them now, barely visible through the morning fog rolling off the river. 6 riders total. Maybe 7. Victor Lang sat at the front once again, calm as church stone beneath his black coat. Elias muttered something under his breath. Nayeli stepped beside him carefully, her face draining of color as she counted the horses. "I told you they would come back." Elias kept staring toward the riders. "Looks like they brought company." None of the men moved closer yet. They simply waited near the cottonwoods overlooking the cabin. Patient. Certain. Like wolves that already smelled exhaustion in the snow. Nayeli tightened the blanket around herself. "You should give them the satchel." Elias glanced toward her. "You believe that?" She looked down briefly. "I believe survival matters." Elias studied her face carefully then. The fear was still there, but underneath it sat something heavier. Resignation. The kind born from years of running. Years of watching powerful men win because ordinary people eventually became too tired to keep fighting them. Elias turned back toward the riders again. Then slowly, without speaking, he walked past Nayeli toward the old gun cabinet beside the fireplace. He opened the bottom drawer instead. Inside rested a faded leather marshal badge wrapped in cloth beneath years of dust. Nayeli stared at it in silence. Elias picked up the badge carefully and looked toward the riders outside. Victor Lang forgot something, he said quietly. Before I became a rancher, I used to be the law in Blackstone territory. For a long moment, Nayeli only stared at the faded badge resting in Elias Crow's hand. The silver had dulled with age, and dust still clung to the edges where years of silence had buried it beneath old memories. But the engraved words remained clear enough in the morning light coming through the cabin window. Territorial Marshal, Blackstone District. Nayeli looked back toward Elias slowly, studying him as though she suddenly realized the man who pulled her from the river was not as simple as he pretended to be. You were law? She asked quietly. Elias gave a dry shrug and slipped the badge into his coat pocket. Long time ago. Outside, the riders remained near the cottonwoods overlooking the cabin. The fog drifting off Red Hollow River curled around their horses like smoke from an old battlefield. Victor Lang sat motionless in the saddle, watching the cabin patiently through the pale morning haze. Elias recognized that kind of patience. Men with money learned early they rarely needed to hurry. Eventually, fear usually did the work for them. Elias crossed toward the wash basin and splashed cold water across his face. The exhaustion in his reflection startled him slightly. He had spent 6 years hiding from old ghosts out here among cattle and river mud, pretending isolation counted as peace. Now the past sat outside his cabin on horseback waiting for him to choose a side. Nayeli carefully tightened the blanket around her shoulders. If you were Marshal, she said softly, then you know how this ends. Elias dried his face with a cloth before answering. Usually with somebody lying. Nayeli lowered her eyes at that. And usually the powerful men are believed. Elias could not argue with her there either. He remembered courtrooms in Blackstone filled with polished boots and expensive watches, while poor ranchers stood hat in hand praying truth mattered more than reputation. Most times it did not. He walked toward the front window again and studied the riders outside. No rifles raised. No shouting. Lang understood appearances. He wanted witnesses later to remember calm businessmen asking politely for stolen property. Men like him buried truth beneath manners. You should leave before this gets worse, Nayeli whispered suddenly. Elias glanced back toward her. She stood near the fireplace now, one hand resting against her ribs while the other gripped the satchel tightly. Those men only care about the papers. If I disappear, this ends for you. Elias looked at her for several seconds without speaking. Then he reached for the coffee kettle and poured the last warm cup into a tin mug before sliding it toward her across the table. Nothing ends that easy, he said quietly. Nayeli stared down at the coffee but did not touch it. You do not owe me anything. Elias leaned against the edge of the table. Maybe not. Silence settled between them again. Outside, the horses shifted impatiently near the tree line. Somewhere in the canyon below, the river continued roaring through the rocks like distant thunder that never stopped. Elias finally spoke without looking at her. 6 years ago, after Claire died, I stopped wearing that badge because I got tired of watching rich men twist the law into rope. His jaw tightened slightly. I figured hiding out here made me different from them somehow. Nayeli lifted her eyes toward him carefully. And now, Elias stared out the window toward Victor Lang. Now I think hiding just made their job easier. The words lingered in the cabin heavier than smoke. Nayeli slowly wrapped both hands around the warm tin cup at last. The heat trembled faintly through her fingers. Elias noticed she looked less afraid than before. Not safe yet, but less alone. Then a sudden sound echoed from outside. Another horse approaching fast from the eastern trail. Elias immediately straightened and moved toward the porch. Nayeli followed carefully behind him. Through the fog, a lone rider emerged from the canyon crossing carrying a sheriff's hat beneath one arm. Older man, gray beard, tired horse. Sheriff Ben Holloway. Elias narrowed his eyes slightly. He had not seen Holloway in nearly 7 years. The sheriff slowed his horse near Victor Lang's group first. Brief words passed between them too quietly to hear. Then Holloway looked toward Elias's cabin with an expression that made something cold settle deep inside Elias's chest. Not anger. Regret. Sheriff Holloway finally nudged his horse forward alone until he stopped 10 feet from the porch steps. Rainwater dripped slowly from the brim of his hat, while his tired eyes settled on Elias Crow for the first time in years. "Morning, Marshal," Holloway said quietly. "Looks like the past finally found you too." Sheriff Ben Holloway climbed down from his horse slowly, joints stiff from years in the saddle and too many winters chasing men who usually escaped punishment anyway. The morning fog drifted low around his boots, while Victor Lang and the other riders remained near the cottonwoods, watching silently from a distance. Elias stood on the porch with one hand resting near the old marshal badge inside his coat pocket. Nayeli remained just behind him in the cabin doorway, wrapped in the gray blanket, the leather satchel held tightly against her chest. Holloway removed his hat and sighed heavily. "You always did know how to find trouble, Crow." Elias gave a faint, humorless smile. "Funny. I spent 6 years trying not to." The sheriff glanced toward Nayeli briefly before lowering his voice. "Lang says she stole legal documents tied to Blackstone Valley claims." Nayeli looked down immediately, like she already expected how this conversation ended. Elias noticed that. He also noticed how her fingers tightened around the satchel when Holloway spoke. Fear had become instinct for her long ago. Elias stepped down from the porch into the wet mud between them. "And what do you say?" Holloway looked tired suddenly. Older than Elias remembered. "I say I am too old to keep pretending men like Victor Lang built this territory honestly." The sheriff's words hung quietly in the cold morning air. Out near the trees, Lang's expression hardened slightly, though he remained seated on horseback. Holloway turned toward the riders and raised his voice just enough to carry across the fog. "I already sent word to the territorial court in Mason Ridge last night." Victor Lang's posture changed immediately. Small movement, barely noticeable, but Elias caught it. "Those papers are under legal protection now," Holloway continued calmly. "Nobody touches them until a judge sees every signature tied to Blackstone Valley." Silence spread across the canyon afterward. Even the river below seemed quieter somehow. Victor Lang slowly guided his horse forward a few feet through the fog. "Careful, Sheriff," he called smoothly. A lot of important people could suffer from old misunderstandings being reopened. Holloway gave a tired laugh beneath his breath. "Funny thing about truth. Victor." He settled his hat back onto his head. "It gets heavier the longer men bury it." Lang stared at the sheriff for several long seconds. Then finally his gaze shifted toward Elias. "You really plan to throw your life away protecting this?" Elias looked back toward the cabin doorway where Nayeli stood frozen in the pale morning light. The woman he dragged from the river less than 12 hours ago now looked less like someone drowning and more like someone exhausted from surviving alone too long. Elias thought about his father sitting awake through endless nights with guilt eating holes through him from the inside. Thought about Claire smiling at strangers because she believed kindness still mattered somewhere in the world. Then Elias looked back toward Victor Lang. "No," he answered quietly. "I think I finally got tired of throwing my life away hiding from it." For the first time all morning, Victor Lang looked uncertain. Not afraid. Men like him rarely felt fear, but uncertain enough to realize the story was slipping beyond his control. He pulled lightly on the reins and turned his horse back toward the cottonwoods. One by one, the other riders followed him into the fog without another word. Holloway watched them disappear before exhaling slowly. "That will not be the end of it," he muttered. Elias nodded once. "I know." The sheriff glanced toward Nayeli, standing silently in the doorway. "Court wagon reaches Mason Ridge in 2 days," he said. "You both should leave before sunset if you want those papers seen by honest eyes." Honest eyes? Elias almost smiled at how rare those sounded these days. Holloway climbed back onto his horse and tipped his hat once before riding east through the foggy canyon trail. Soon only the sound of the river remained again. Elias stood there alone while staring at the empty valley. Then he heard soft footsteps behind him. Nayeli stepped carefully onto the porch beside him with the blanket wrapped close against the cold morning air. The river wind moved gently through her dark hair, now drying beneath the rising sun. "You could still stay here," she whispered. "Forget all of this." Elias looked toward the old cabin behind them. The lonely chair near the fire. The silence he once believed was peace. Then he looked back toward the road leading east. "I already buried enough ghosts in this valley." Naeli studied him quietly for several seconds before slipping the silver wedding band from the leather cord around her neck. She placed it carefully into the palm of her hand and stared at it beneath the morning light. Thomas used to say rivers remember everything men try to hide, she said softly. Elias glanced toward the roaring water below the canyon cliffs. Maybe that is why the river brought you here. Naeli looked at him then. Really looked at him for the first time since he pulled her from the floodwater. Not like a stranger. Not like a threat. Just two tired souls standing at the edge of something uncertain and honest. Slowly, she closed her fingers around the ring again and nodded once. Then together, without another word, they turned toward the cabin as the morning sun finally broke across Red Hollow Valley.